What I want to do is essentially give an overview of international justice today, and also sort of press us a little bit, make us ask and answer the questions as to what is international justice, why do we have it, what good does it do? But let me start by first introducing, or at least a little bit setting the scene for what I want to talk about. The world today obviously remains a place of deep conflict. From Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, from Burma to Colombia, from Iraq to the Congo, there's war, there's violence, and with this war, with this violence, there's not only individual criminal activity, that is, individual soldiers, individual citizens, civilians who commit acts of violence, but there's also systematic, policy-driven violence against civilians and against combatants. Now, the international community, and that's a phrase that's used a lot without necessarily a lot of meaning, but the international community, that is governments, international organizations, non-governmental organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, different kinds, SGI, individual activists, everybody who makes up the international community, together we have a variety of tools at our disposal in order to deal with this kind of violence. Everything from shaming of individuals who are committing crimes, to economic sanctions, all the way to military intervention, which, at least under international law, may be authorized by the United Nations Security Council. But there's another tool out there, and it's this other tool that I want to talk about today, and that tool is law, right? It's the rule of law. It's a tool that's been increasingly developed, particularly since the end of the Cold War, even though it has its roots in the Nuremberg trials, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg in 1945 and 1946. But at root, it's about holding individuals accountable for crimes, whether they pull the trigger and kill 1, 2, 10, 20 people in a particular massacre, or whether they're way at the top of the political pyramid and they order the death of tens of thousands of individuals. In my talk today, I'm going to talk about that process, the process of bringing law to a situation where we think law doesn't normally operate. Right? Cicero said, and I don't speak Latin, so I'm not going to say what he said in Latin, but he said essentially that in times of war, the law is silent. Right? In the face of arms, there's no law. But we know that's not true. Whether it works, whether it's effective in ending crime and ending violence is another question, and we'll be talking about that. But I'm going to be talking about the introduction of law in time of war. So what I'll first try to do is introduce some of the institutions in international justice. I'll then try to pick apart contemporary international justice and ask the question, why do we have it? Why do we have international justice? Why do we have these institutions? And what are its purposes? Does it do good? Does it do good always? Sometimes? Never? What is the point and why do we have it? And then at the end I'll invite some questions, invite a little discussion to see if we can maybe move forward our understanding of what international justice is. And in the middle I'll show a little film, it being Southern California, needing a little film to demonstrate a little bit what I'm talking about. Okay, so I have some slides over here which are just pictures to entertain. They don't necessarily tell us too much, but a little bit of illustration as we go along. So I'm going to start with a specific time. It's July 2008, last July, and I want to talk about two different acts, or two different events that happened within the space of a week that really brought the issue of international justice to the fore. It was sort of this moment in time, mid to late July last year, before the Democratic or Republican conventions, slow news cycles perhaps, but for about a week, the newspapers were dominated by stories of international justice, and I'll talk about these two. So the first is Darfur. It's on the far left, where it's July 17th in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. So as everybody knows, I suspect everybody knows about Darfur, this conflict-ridden land in the western part of Darfur. Darfur, western part of Sudan, was in the news last July, much as the severe violence there has been in the news over the past 5 or 6 years. This time, however, it wasn't about the violence per se. It was in the news because a prosecutor in The Hague, the seat of government in the Netherlands, had decided to seek an arrest warrant against the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir. The prosecutor, his name is Luis Moreno Ocampo. He's the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, which I'll talk about a little bit later. He alleged that Bashir bore responsibility for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and sort of the heart of his claim, genocide against civilians in Darfur. And he sought an arrest warrant. He didn't just seek an arrest warrant for some individual who might have been a member of the Janjaweed militia, this militia that has done really much of the killing in Darfur, although he's also sought arrest warrants for a Janjaweed leader. He didn't seek an arrest warrant just for somebody who had raped women or killed individuals in the camps or in the villages of Darfur. He went straight to the top. He said, Omar al-Bashir, as president of Sudan, bears ultimate responsibility for what is going on in Darfur. Bears ultimate responsibility for the genocide, as he defines it, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And he asked the court to issue an arrest warrant against Bashir, a sitting head of state. Bashir is still the president of Sudan. Just in March, as you might recall, a three-judge panel at the ICC accepted his arguments on crimes against humanity and war crimes and actually issued an arrest warrant. So there's now an arrest warrant that's been issued for Omar al-Bashir, and I don't want to get into the legalities quite yet as to whether that's actually likely to be implemented, but in March, since March, he's been under threat of arrest. Now, within a week of the Bashir arrest warrant request last July, a remarkable thing occurred. Serb police in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, arrested a homeopathic healer practicing in Belgrade. The healer went by the name of Dragan Dabic, but he had another name too. He had a real name, which was Radovan Perdic. When I teach human rights or international justice at UCLA, most of my students, they were in elementary school at the time of the war in Bosnia, but for any of us who lived during that time, the name Radovan Perdic is sort of one of these striking names of individuals who were really quite responsible for most of the carnage in Bosnia between 1991 and 1995. Perdic had been indicted in 1994 by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. He'd been sought by NATO for several years. It had been thought that Perdic had been on the run in the mountains and the monasteries of Montenegro or Serbia, maybe even in the Serb part of Bosnia. But lo and behold, he was right under the noses of security forces in Serbia. My guess is that they knew that he was there for many years, because as soon as there was a change of government to a liberal government in Serbia, within a month, Perdic was arrested and sent to The Hague for trial. And very shortly, he's going to start standing trial for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide that occurred in Bosnia between 1991 and 1995, including the massacre at Srebrenica in July of 1995, which killed somewhere around 8,000 Bosnian boys and men, Bosnian Muslim boys and men. And he's also going to be tried for his responsibility for the siege of Sarajevo, which also left thousands of people dead between 91 and 95. So as a result, for last summer, a week last summer, during this pre-convention lull, U.S. and international newspapers were dominated by this question of international justice. Why is it that we're going after these senior leaders? Why are we going after Radovan Perdic years after the war has ended? Why are we going after Bashir in the midst of conflict? How do we go after these people? Right? What is the purpose of international justice? What's it all about? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is all about. First by kind of describing the scene, and then asking some questions about it. So the first is what are the crimes at issue? Mainly, international criminal justice is about justice for the victims. It's also about some other things, peace and security, about accountability. But at its root, it's about accountability for three kinds of crimes. Right? It's about accountability for crimes against humanity, which are described as essentially systematic and widespread attacks and maltreatment of civilian populations. They can also be combatants, can be victims as well. So crimes against humanity. Here we have, there's a picture of individuals. Pictures were taken, and some of you may have read about the current trials of a torturer, really the lead torturer of the Khmer Rouge, a man who goes by the name of Joik. Before each of the torture sessions and at which they were killed, individuals' pictures were taken, and these pictures are collected in a museum in Phnom Penh. And that first picture up in the upper left-hand corner is a snapshot of those pictures. But crimes against humanity are massive, systematic crimes against civilians. Then there are war crimes. Crimes that take place against civilians, against combatants, against interned people, whether they're civilians or combatants. They're violations of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, such as torture, maltreatment of prisoners of war, murder of protected persons, such as civilians or detainees, etc. Those are war crimes. These tribunals that we'll be talking about have jurisdiction over war crimes in addition to crimes against humanity. And then finally, there's genocide. Genocide is defined as a number of acts, killing, serious harm, all intended to destroy, in whole or in part, national, ethnic, or religious groups. So genocide, really more than just about any other crime in the international community, is about a crime of policy. Right? It's about a kind of crime that's directed against an entire population with the intent of wiping it out. Now, there are a lot of legal issues about whether genocide is too narrowly defined under jurisprudence today, and I don't want to get into that necessarily. Suffice it to say that genocide right now in international law is an extremely difficult thing to prove. It's much easier to prove crimes against humanity or war crimes because you don't have to go into the mind of the person who committed and ask, well, did they intend to destroy in whole or in part this particular group? Okay, so these kinds of crimes are not new to the international community. War crimes, crimes against humanity in particular, are not new. Genocide wasn't defined until 1948. Nuremberg changes things. Right? So in the wake of the Holocaust, in the wake of the massive crimes of the Nazis during World War II, there's a sense in publics in the West, in particular, publics among the Allies, that inaction against Nazi leaders simply was not going to be an option. You know, in past conflicts, those who commit crimes are either executed on the spot, which is actually what Winston Churchill wanted to do in around 1943, 1944. He thought that the Allies should just execute the senior Nazi leaders. That's the way it had been done, right? Either people go to their death in front of a firing squad, or they go to a villa in the south of France. But FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in particular, including a number of other senior American leaders, thought that wasn't going to be the appropriate way to deal with Nazi leaders. That we needed to have a different mechanism. We had to do something that actually would allow us to use this moment at the end of World War II as a teaching moment. And the Allies, therefore, in 1945, opted for the International Military Tribunal for Nuremberg.